Today, I'm joined by Emma Offord, a neurodivergent therapist and coach who supports families navigating life with ADHD, autism, sensory differences, and everything in between. She brings both professional insights and lived experience, and I'm so grateful to have her here to talk about what life is really like when your child is neurodivergent.
Pleasure to be here.
Emma, would you start off by telling our listeners today just a little bit about yourself and your journey?
Yeah, so I'm a clinical psychologist, and I wasn't always a clinical psychologist. I used to work in business and computing, but it definitely wasn't for me. And I am the founder of Divergent Life, which is a neuroaffirming service for neurodivergent children and families. We offer coaching, mentoring. We do assessments for neurodivergence as well. I'm also a writer and a speaker on neurodivergence and a real advocate for systemic change. So that's a huge part of the work that I do. And I'm also a mum. And I'm professionally a specialist in neurodivergence, but I'm also a late identified neurodivergent woman.
Wow, okay. So what led you exactly into working with neurodivergence? Was it your own diagnosis or how did you end up there?
Yeah, it's like quite a story of like following breadcrumbs is how I describe it. So I knew about some of my traits of neurodivergence, but not all of my traits, which I think surprises people because I'm a trained assessor and clinical psychologist, but how I was trained was not with the kind of emerging understanding that we've got, which is to be thinking about high masking and different presentations of neurodivergence. So it wasn't clear to me, all of my neurodivergent traits. But I was working in hospitals, I was working in schools, I was working in different services, and I was seeing how the system was really failing lots of people. So psychological therapy was not really helping people, or was even maybe making people feel worse. So I was noticing that happening, and I was becoming quite sort of disillusioned, I think, with my profession. And then I started to see myself in the client work that I was doing, and I heavily researched the neurodiversity movement and started to see this completely different understanding of what neurodivergence is. I saw myself in that, went through an assessment as well, did a lot of my own assessments. And that led me to really, I had to act. I couldn't just hold this knowledge and just carry on working how I was working. I needed to do something that was more activist, that was going to try to change the narrative of how we do assessments, how we consider people to be disordered, and to look at different ways of working with people, actually. Yeah, that's how I got here.
Wow, that's an incredible story. Assessments is a big one for people, isn't it? It's knowing where to start. It's quite daunting, isn't it? Especially if you're a parent with a child that's being, potential neurodivergence. How do you? Can you give us any advice on how to go through the assessment system?
Gosh, that is a tough question to answer because there's so much advice I would want to give to people. But I'd start with what you've just said. It's a heavy weight for a lot of people to go through that process. And what I think some people don't realise is the vulnerability that when you put your child forward or you are going for an assessment, you feel very vulnerable. Yeah. Because you're not in charge of the outcome. You're not in charge of the process. So I think it's really important to be looking for the right person to do the assessment for your child or for yourself. So don't be scared to ask questions. Don't be scared to ask what the process is like. It's your right to do that if you're going for a private assessment and if you're going for an NHS assessment as well. I think we all know that the wait list is incredibly long. I think I've heard things like up to 15, 22 years in some parts of the country, which blows my mind. But we know it's long. So I think many people are having to turn to going for a private assessment. So absolutely do your research. Think about who's doing the assessment, what the process is. I would always recommend a neuroaffirming assessment. So that is an assessment where you're exploring identity. You're not looking to identify a problem necessarily, and you're not looking at that person through the lens of disorder and dysfunction. You're really looking at that person's identity, their different neurobiological traits.
Mm-hmm.
You're using affirming language. You're helping a person feel seen,
Mm-hmm.
not othered. And I think that brings a lot of safety to the process.
Mm-hmm.
When you're not being assessed to be put in a box of disorder with a symptom checklist and feeling very clinically observed and very clinically judged in that sort of way.
Yeah.
When you're actually exploring your identity in a much more, I think, safe and helpful way where you get to learn about yourself.
Yeah.
And you get to learn about your child in meaningful ways so that you can actually help support them and advocate for them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah.
I've been diagnosed with dyslexia when I was 7, and my son, anyone who's listened to the podcast will know that my son has been diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia. And I found the process was quite long for my son. It's obviously when you're being sort of assessed on things that you find quite challenging. So he didn't really enjoy the process.
Yeah.
But I personally found it beneficial to have the diagnosis because it helped us to understand his kind of strengths and his weaknesses and where we could help, and then get that support from the school as well. Because I know obviously a lot of people are unsure as to whether to go down that route or not in the first place, aren't they? Which can be quite confusing.
Yeah, and I always say to people, you don't have to wait for a diagnosis to get started. Like, you can start looking at these traits yourself. You can start thinking about maybe your child's sensory profile. You can start looking at how they process information. So you can get started without going down a diagnostic route. You don't have to wait for that to start to work with your child and help your child.
Can you give us any early signs then of neurodivergence?
Yeah. So the majority of people who come to me and my service are more, I would say, high masking. And so the signs are not as obvious for that population. And I think this is what, the neurodiversity movement is highlighting, is that there has been an idea that you can see autism, you can see ADHD. It's a very behavioural, observational way of assessing or judging someone's neurodivergence. So definitely there are some not obvious signs. I would say they can be quite general and they don't necessarily indicate neurodivergence, but the things that I would look out for are a child who perhaps they struggle with separation from their parents. So this is very often at night we see this. And I think I see this in almost all the children that I've ever assessed. Yeah.
What sort of age?
It can be, from the very, very early years. So it's not like they were sleeping on their own and then they started to, need to have their parent there. Although that can happen, but a lot of children really struggle to sleep alone. They need help getting to sleep as well. So many of the neurodivergent children are camping on like mattresses in their parents' bed or in their bed. I had somebody who had, they eventually moved to having a string around the mum's finger and a string around the child.
Oh,
so
wow.
they were still linked by the string, but in separate bedrooms.
Yeah,
like,
there's a book around that, isn't there, as well? I can't remember the title of it, that talks about the invisible strings, which is a wonderful one for helping with separation anxiety at bedtime.
Yeah, and I wonder about that. We call it separation anxiety, which, of course, that can happen without being a neurodivergent person, but I wonder how many children are actually experiencing neurodivergent like neurobiology within that whole separation anxiety context. So it happens at night. Certainly we see it in school. So when children start to separate from their parent, go into these environments that are perhaps not as predictable, they might be more demanding. On a sensory level, they've got completely like different sensory stimuli than a child might be used to. And so that's one of the main indicators, certainly for us, is that a child is struggling to be in school. It can also be the opposite, where they're in school and they seem to be doing really, really well. So they're being described as like easygoing and like just like the perfect child, or, there's no problems, we don't see anything. Then they come home and they completely melt down. So what that child then is doing is often holding in or suppressing quite a lot of sensory discomfort. They're really trying to mask and fit into that environment and fit into the demands of that environment. But that really works against their neurobiology. So when they get home and then it's a safe environment, that's the recovery time.
Yeah. I understand that. I went through that a lot with my son, that the school would kind of dispute some of the issues I would raise, certainly around some of the sensory things.
Yeah.
But then, like you say, he'd get home and it would all come out, you know, in its worst form. And it would take a good hour, sometimes 2 hours, to kind of level him again. But I understand that as masking then, because the school would sometimes suggest that if these things weren't happening in school as well as at home, almost more that it was behavioural rather than it actually being a problem, which as a parent I found quite frustrating, because as a parent you just know, don't you? You know that there's something that's not quite in the box, for want for a better word, that is perhaps within the realms of what other people might be experiencing. So it can be very frustrating when you're told something like that.
It can be really scary as well, because it's almost as though many parents are kind of doubted.
Yeah.
And so then what comes into question is their parenting, their child's behaviour, like you say, that they're an anxious parent. And it's scary because you're not getting the help that you know your child is going to need. So trying to communicate that with a high masking child is really, really difficult. So often when we are doing assessments and we speak to the school, we just hear a completely different narrative to what we hear from the parent.
Yeah.
And the parents are really anxious about that, understandably, because this judgment could land on them. But, you know, when we really look deeper, we can see that there's a child who is suppressing so much, and then all that dysregulation happens at home where they feel safe. And they don't feel necessarily that safe from a physical or psychological perspective in the school.
So from your experience then, as somebody who does assessments and obviously working with families, what would you suggest to any parent that comes to you and says, like, I have got all these concerns, these are the things that are happening at home, but they're not recognising that at school, so don't feel listened to or don't feel heard or supported. How do they begin to deal with that?
Yeah. So part of the assessment's purpose is to really describe that, to dig deep and create a narrative where a school can see. That's what I meant about a child being seen, a family being seen through an assessment. And in an assessment, and especially a neuro-affirming one, you are using lots of different methods to try to describe those neurodivergent traits and how they show up and how they don't show up in certain environments. So a child could receive a sensory profile. So you're uncovering how they react to certain sensory stimuli, and then you can describe that in terms of the context of school. We tend to use some technology that actually uses a camera and a computer to track children's movement and eye movement, even when they're asked to sit still in a task. So we can track body movements and stims that can be sort of micro movements that to a trained eye you might notice, but it's not a child doing cartwheels in the classroom.
Yeah.
But you're kind of recreating a classroom situation where you've got to sit still, stare straight ahead, and maybe be doing a boring task. And that camera carefully and cleverly like maps and monitors that child. So we can bring in lots of different evidence as assessors to help change that narrative in school. And what I'm really I really advocate about is that I think assessors should be trauma informed and trauma trained, because actually a lot of what we're seeing are traumatized young people.
Okay. Yeah.
So when you're high masking all the time, your nervous system is constantly going into survival. And that can have like a cumulative effect where a child eventually might end up in burnout or in a sort of freeze response, a kind of trauma response. I'd call it a neurodivergent trauma response, because it's not how a lot of people understand trauma to present, or what might be considered even traumatic. Like school isn't considered traumatic, but it is for some neurodivergent people.
Yeah.
So when you can also assess for trauma and trauma responses, then you can describe what's happening for that child from a neurobiological nervous system level. And, you know, I can't think of any time a school hasn't listened eventually when you can really deeply explain something like that.
That's really good to know. And that's good advice for any parents who are wondering what to do.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay.
Thank you.
What does the term sensory differences mean?
Yeah, so it's such a huge field. I'll do my best to break it down. So sensory differences, everyone has a sensory profile. Everyone in the whole world will have preferences and differences. So we're often looking at things like visual stimuli, how the body and mind respond to visual stimuli, how it responds to taste, textures, noise. We also have like internal experiences of sensations like a heartbeat or hunger. So our nervous system is constantly interacting with the external world and our internal system on a sensory level. And it's argued that neurodivergent people might have variations in their sensory experience that can be maybe more intense, maybe harder to process, maybe more sensitive. It can be a variety of different things. So people can be sensory sensitive, which means their nervous system is being triggered into probably an uncomfortable, overwhelmed state. It might be fight, flight, it might be freeze. People can also be sensory seeking. So that means they are seeking out purposely certain sensory stimuli so that helps regulate them or brings them joy.
Yeah. So as in someone that likes to taste more, have a, you know, more spice, more extremes.
All of that. Yeah, all of that. And you can be a mixture. So I'm, for example, sensory sensitive to artificial lights.
Right.
These ones are okay. If they're above my head, as in like those office lights, and there was many of them, that would really dysregulate me. So I would become very, very stressed and irritable. Yeah. And by the time I got home, I would need some kind of dark room to recover. But I'm also sensory seeking. Okay. So I would seek natural light and I seek movement. So you can be sensitive and you can be seeking in the same category.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's actually quite complex. People often talk about sensory sensitivity in neurodivergence, but they don't talk about the complex interplay of where we are fluctuating in and around all of that.
I understand that.
And then think of a multi-sensory environment like school. It's like a sensory assault for so many kids. They're taking all that in while trying to manage relationships and trying to learn. So if you have a spiky profile or a highly sensitive profile or a need for movement, it's going to be a really difficult environment to navigate.
Absolutely. And you can see how that then plays that trauma piece in.
Exactly.
There's so much going on for that child that's just not being seen.
Completely. And then also, if they try to speak about it, it's dismissed, invalidated, don't be ridiculous, everyone else is coping. What's the problem? You're being too sensitive. And so that's a relational trauma that starts to build up for many children, that they silence themselves, that they're not being validated or accepted. They doubt themselves. They become very disembodied, many children as well. So they can't listen to their body because it can't be trusted because no one else is agreeing. So there's so many messages to that child in those kind of environments. And it's not teachers' faults. It's not the school's fault. And there's not the education. They don't know about this. So,
I think Jamie Oliver's been highlighting a lot of work on it, hasn't he? That teachers, I think he said, get about a day to half a day's training on neurodivergence in their entire teacher training, which when you think about it is absolutely crazy when we think of everything that comes under the umbrella of neurodivergent, that's all the training that goes into it. So, if a teacher has got 30 children in their class, they're probably already overwhelmed with how much they've got to do, let alone being able to begin to support a child with any form of neurodivergence, recognise these things and flag them up to give them any support or help. It's kind of no wonder really, in some respects, when a parent is raising some of these issues saying, have you seen X, Y, and Z, that maybe the teacher has missed it. And that's through no fault of their own, but there's just too many other things happening for them.
And I think if teachers had this education, it would give them permission to let go of things that maybe they don't feel they should be or need to be upholding or that isn't right for the child. Yeah. Because that breaks the boundaries of how school is structured. When you start to be more neuro-affirming in schools, then you allow for differences. You allow different ways of teaching and playing and moving to exist.
Yeah.
So I think it would be incredibly freeing for teachers and be a real tool for them to actually have that information.
Absolutely. I think something does need to change, really, doesn't it, with the whole schooling system? I keep hearing so much about the archaic ways of learning, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And we're knowing more now than ever of how 25% of children have a neurodivergence and they're just not being catered for in the schooling system. And it's just an absolute sin that they're being missed.
It's really sad. And we get a lot of... So I also, in our service, we do school trauma reports. And so we assess for school trauma, maybe alongside neurodivergence, or it might be neurodivergent children. And we're trying to educate schools to help them understand that this idea of school trauma does exist. And it can seem like such a big, scary word, but really what you're looking at are children going into a survival response in that environment. And that is trauma. So, we've had some amazing conversations with schools and with teachers, and they have been freed up to think about things so differently using that neuro-affirming trauma lens. I love this one story where a teacher had emailed a parent about a child and said, "We're worried about her well-being. She's fallen asleep again." And the parent was sort of a little bit concerned about them, worried about the well-being. What do you mean? What are you trying to say? And we spoke to the school. We said, what lesson is this happening? Is it all the lessons? No, just English, Shakespeare. And we said, this is a child who's just shutting down. She's just checking out because it's not impacting her interest-based nervous system. So our advice would be, let her sleep. Just leave her to have a nap.
Yeah.
Or maybe spice it up a bit so it's more interesting for her.
Yeah.
And, the teachers, I could almost through the email hear them like, I don't know how to respond to this woman with that advice, because no one typically says, let a child sleep, let a child move, let them do these things. But when you simplify it and say, well, that's what they need.
Yeah.
It's like takes so much unlearning for people because they have to go through all these ableist barriers of no, children can't do that. They can't just sleep in class. That can't be allowed. So I think that information is so helpful and safe for people. Yeah. Because it helps them unlearn things that are like rules for living that don't need to be rules for living.
You're so right. And it's just the way we've all kind of been conditioned, isn't it, about how education is being delivered. And my son, I have a sort of similar example. Obviously, being dyslexic, French is not something that he particularly enjoys or finds very easy. He's struggling enough with learning the English language. Yeah. So I sort of addressed it with the school that I didn't want him to continue French or Spanish because that time could be much better spent learning on some skills that he needs, to get him through his day-to-day life, rather than learning two languages that just aren't going to serve him given his dyslexia and where he's at. And when I asked my son about it, I said, do you enjoy French? How do you feel about it? And he said, Mummy, I just put it in my head bin. I was like, right, okay, why is that? And he said, because I don't understand and I don't like it. So he said, I have a bin in my head and it just goes in there.
I love
and
that.
It was just his way of gently explaining to me that he's not stressed about it, because we're quite open about being neurodivergent in my family, and I've always, there's no pressure, just do your best. And he was quite happy to just let me know that it's not for him. He just can't process it. He just can't take it in. It's not worth it. So as far as he's concerned, he leaves the lesson and it's in his head bin, and then he carries on with his day.
I love that. And I think that is the beauty of a neuro-affirming family. Yeah. Like when you understand each other's traits, then you can communicate about them and it can feel very, very safe. And you don't get stressed about it. When it's not understood and there's this feeling of I have to conform, I have to comply, that is what's so damaging for children. When you can have conversations like that and have the lovely response you must have given him, then that sense of safety builds to be more expressive about what your needs are, and it reduces the masking that goes on. So I love that idea of having neuro-affirming families where we're talking about traits. We're not talking about disorder. We're not talking about dysfunction. We're talking about our differences and our preferences and our needs, which is a completely different conversation.
Absolutely. And it's quite common, isn't it, that neurodivergence will run in families. And often people who are looking to diagnose their children are kind of suddenly looking at themselves, aren't they, going, do you know what? That reminds me of me, you know. And you see that coming a lot more. Yeah.
So we'll get, say, a child coming to us for an assessment, and then the parents, you know, recognising their neurodivergence through that assessment, or their partners. And then, so then the mum and the dad comes back, then a sibling might come, then a cousin, then an aunt.
Really? That's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's, I think that's beautiful. I know a lot of people are calling it trend and kind of taking that stance, but actually it's this spread of knowledge that's happening. And, you know, I feel like the world waking up. Yeah. To me, it's an awakening and a movement, not like... Who would do that for a trend? It's
absolutely,
you know,
I know, because there's conversations, aren't there, around, you know, is neurodivergence, is it more common nowadays, or is it the fact that we're just recognising it and understanding it so much more?
Yeah.
And I think if I take myself and my family, I think personally we do just recognise and understand it a lot more. That's certainly one piece to the puzzle, because looking back historically, I definitely think my dad is dyslexic, but you know, 70 something years ago, it just wouldn't have even been considered. No. And now for myself, I knew exactly what to look for in my children, because knowing that I have dyslexia, I knew the chances of one of them or more having it was, you know, high. Yeah. And you can start to see those patterns in families, and moving forwards, that will probably become something that more and more families see.
And I think, you know, that to me is just bringing safety into parenting and bringing safety into schools, if it's in schools, that understanding. What I see, and I guess maybe a lot of people wouldn't see who don't or haven't worked as a clinical psychologist, is like I'll have people presenting with an eating disorder or a really extreme episode of an OCD theme or addiction. Underlying that is neurodivergence and people struggling. And so I think, no, people weren't seen, but this is, you know, these other presentations were actually their survival responses. Yeah. Trying to survive in this world, trying to stay safe. And it has shown up like that. So for me, I'm very passionate about this movement, because it creates that safety where people don't have to suppress through alcohol and addiction or restrictive eating, or, you know, different ways that it can show up. I see the safety that maybe others don't see quite so much.
Absolutely. I fully agree with that. I think it is just that acceptance and helping that person just learn who they are for, you know, whatever traits that they are, that's them, and just understanding the why can really help, I think. Yeah. You know, rather than just wondering why somebody's different to you, you know.
I think one of the main comments people say to me is that whether it's an assessment or some kind of neurodivergent coaching or learning about their neurodivergent traits in whichever way, they bring a lot of compassion to themselves, whereas before they were pushing through, they were trying to change, adapt, camouflage. You know, I always call it the me I should be, carrying this heavy weight of the me I should be that I'm not. And they start to be who they are. They start to say no. Yeah. You know, they start to let go of people pleasing. The masking, you know, becomes more optional than something they feel they have to do. And that compassion is incredible to witness in people. Again, it's that sense of safety that they can bring to themselves. And it doesn't have to be this external seeking of validation. They can validate internally by understanding their traits more.
Absolutely. I think that's imperative. How can we tell then if a child is masking?
Good question. Do you know, I always think you can usually tell by the cost that you might not always see the mask, but you might see the cost to that child.
Okay. Explain to me what you mean by that.
Yeah. So I would say that are the things that we've touched on, which are burnout. They are the dysregulation when you come back from certain environments. Definitely when there's incongruence, when there's a narrative of a child melting down or freezing at home and, you know, dissociating or just showing lots of, you know, kind of mental health concerns. But in another environment, they're presenting completely differently. That's the high masking environment that they're in, and that's when the mask shows. So the those are the kind of things that I think to look out for. It might also be, you know your child, and then you're hearing them talk about relationships, and you're thinking to yourself, you don't like that. You don't want to do that kind of thing outside of that relationship.
Yeah.
So what's happening there is that child is masking to stay in those relationships or to be accepted and perceived as, a predominant neurotype. And like everybody masks, everybody. So you are looking at different degrees. So you're thinking about a child who's high masking, which means they are really suppressing their needs and they are doing things that are really outside of their comfort zone. So if they're in these relationships and your instinct is telling you that's not safe, what they're doing is really beyond, what maybe an average person might do in a relationship to mask, then that's where you would be thinking, okay, my child might be a high masking individual.
Okay, that's good to know. What are some of the common ways neurodivergent children are misunderstood then? And how can we sort of reframe that behaviour?
How are they misunderstood? I can give you an example maybe, and it's quite a common example. So many children that we work with, again, we'll go back to school, but in particular school canteen is this real sensory assault of smells, noise, like movement, unpredictability, maybe the textures of the food are not what a child would normally want to eat, or they're sensory sensitive to it. So we see many children who the school are describing as picky eaters, too sensitive, difficult, defiant. They're not kind of doing what we ask them to do. And that misunderstanding is born out of not understanding their sensory profile, and that they are acting out of a survival response. They're anxious. Their nervous system is overwhelmed by that environment. And then the more that they're pressured to be in that environment and to conform under those conditions, the more the nervous system is getting dysregulated.
Yeah.
So that dysregulation might show up in the classroom. So it has this knock-on effect where they might be kind of squirming in their chair, they might be doodling, they might be overwhelmed with emotion, they might hit, they might go into a fight response.
Yeah.
Because any trigger then is going to be hard for them to manage because they're so full up with stress. So you can see that there's this trail of like behavior that's observed and criticized and judged and corrected. Underneath is like a sensory profile that isn't, the needs are not being met. Yeah, exactly. So when you can explain that to parents and to schools, then obviously we can start to look at what does that child need. So maybe they need to not be in the school canteen. Maybe they need to eat at different times or snack throughout the day.
Yeah.
Maybe they need some like regulation time between lessons and eating in the canteen. So you can create a completely different school day for them.
Absolutely. Managing that environment, I think, is key, isn't it? Because it can make all the difference to their day. If, like you say, you just take those small moments, like for them, maybe it's eating outside of the canteen so that they can stay more regulated. That can make a huge difference to the child's experience of the day and their trauma response to school.
Yeah, I think it's all about looking for regulation, ways to regulate that. All of that behaviour, the observable behaviour is, how we often talk about it being communication. What's it communicating? It's usually dysregulation. So to me, it's quite straightforward. How do we help that child regulate in an unpredictable environment?
I found that a really useful term to actually understand about how all behaviour is communication. And another one was that my child is not being a problem, they're having a problem.
Yeah.
It's been a really good reframe to me, actually, to just kind of stop and recognise what's happening for him here in his world, whether I see it or not. It's about what he feels and what he sees, and to take a step back from that to try and help him regulate. Because if he's dysregulated in the moment, there's, that's my job to help him regulate and understand what's happening.
Yeah.
And that is a lot of the time just changing the environment.
Completely. And I think it helps regulate us as parents, doesn't it? Because otherwise the situation is escalating because we are missing the mark and we're trying to solve a problem that, in a completely different area to where, the need is needing to be met. We're doing something completely different and everything starts escalating. And so everyone's dysregulated. Yeah. But when we can trust the child and trust ourselves to understand our child through that lens, it makes such a difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree with that. So we've kind of touched on this already, but some kids obviously seem fine at school and completely fall apart when they're at home. So we know there's a lot of masking going on there and that the school sometimes are unaware of what's going on. But any more advice really on what we can give on how to kind of breach that gap between the two situations going on so that the child masks less really and feels more comfortable to explore who they are?
It's a really tough one. Changing environments as parents, like a school environment, is almost an impossible task without something like a diagnosis or a really kind of neurodivergent and trauma-informed school, which do exist. But what I would say, where you do have agency as a parent, is you know that your child is going to be having a very dysregulated day. So you want to build in recovery when they come home. And that can be things like a sensory corner. It can be no talking. Just don't even speak to your child. It can be anything that you know they need to help them regulate. So it might be headphones on, straight on, an iPad or something like that. And letting go of the shoulds, like my child shouldn't be spending so much time on that iPad. Maybe they need that at that moment for that recovery. So recovery is a really important part of it. And also a safe environment so that they can come home and melt down. And you just hold them and co-regulate them through that. And don't put demand on them to do anything else. An environment that is generally low demand. If they want to stim, let them stim. If they want to stand on their head while they're having dinner, let them do that safely. But, I think it really is allowing that neurobiological expression in the home and having conversations with them about how difficult it must be. Saying, I can see how much you're having, all the energy going into being in school and, validating that for them and helping them explain about masking and what happens to them so they know, okay, this is what happens to my nervous system. Maybe I want to be in school. Maybe I want to go on a school trip. So I'm going to opt into masking. But when I come home, I can, express myself in a more authentic way. I think that's a really helpful and healthy narrative for a child to develop. Yeah, I agree with that. In and out of masking, they don't have to stay there. And there's nothing wrong with them in that meltdown moment. That's a consequence of the environment. And like you say, sometimes just holding that space so that they can melt down and they do feel like it's a safe place to come home and let you be with them whilst they go through all those big feelings that they've got in their body after masking for the day. Exactly. Because that must be an exhausting process for them. Exhausting and confusing, really confusing. It's to be that dysregulated, to be in meltdown can be very shaming for a person because when they become more regulated, they look back and think, gosh, this happened. Maybe something was broken. Maybe they said something that they wouldn't normally say. Maybe something hurtful. It can be a very shaming, confusing experience. So you're really helping that child feel safe through that until they're more regulated. It's so important. That's really true, actually. I'd never even looked at it like that, about how shaming it could be for the child when they're regulated to look back. So that's really key information. Adults too. There's a lot of shame and meltdowns and burnout. All those exhausted, overwhelmed nervous system responses hold a lot of shame because it organises us outside of ourselves, how we might normally present. And so that's, again, very shaming, very confusing, very othered. Emma, do you have any final words of advice for the listeners today? Final words of advice. I would say something similar to what I said earlier. Don't wait for a diagnosis. I think the whole world could benefit from learning about different traits. Thinking about our identity through neurobiological understandings, not through the language of disorder. Like, I'm saying you're disordered. To me, that is not a way to look at this. It's to look at your sensory world, how you process information, like what situations do you mask in. I think it's really important to treat these different areas and different traits respectfully and think about them from an identity perspective and get started, whenever you want to. Don't wait for a diagnosis.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for joining us on the podcast today. I feel like we've covered lots of different things there, from, you know, the assessment process to how to handle masking in school and what it must feel like for the child and the parent. You've given us some great advice and a lot for the listeners to take away if they're wondering if their child is maybe neurodivergent or they just want to know more about the topic. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Lovely.